Hello, and welcome to Reveal's 2020 webinar series, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kelly, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. This year's series of webinars provided insights on how to best leverage your SAP asset as it relates to your business and how each functional area would be affected by S/4HANA. Today is our last webinar of 2020, turning SAP into an asset by self-funding your move to S/4HANA. Today's webinar will last 30 to 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer period at the end, along with a special announcement about our upcoming bootcamp. Please capture your questions in the question or chat section, and this webinar is going to be recorded and available on Reveal's website later today under resources. At this time, I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Martin Rowan. Martin is a managing partner here at Reveal, and his primary focus is to facilitate solutions that help companies optimize their integrated supply chains to achieve a level of ERP maturity and increase profitability. He is actively involved with local and international supply chain market and has been for over 20 years. His experience covers a wide variety of industries across multiple countries with specific focus on driving transformational change within the organization and the extended supply chain. With that, I would like to turn this presentation over to Martin.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning to everybody. Much appreciate your time. And as Kelly mentioned, this is kind of the final discussion point on this topic that we had for the year. And if you remember, if you've been following along for the year, you'll notice that we've been really trying to address multiple facets of a supply chain, specifically trying to figure out how do we utilize SAP to its fullest extent to turn it into an asset where we don't have the debate on whether a project has a return on investment specifically to the cost of the project, but is this asset, this SAP ERP software, is it actually producing value to my business? Can I see my business improve? Can I see macro measures improve around inventories and service levels and operational cost and month-end closing, real tangible activities? And so when you look at these different areas over the course of the year, we touched on everything from procurement to manufacturing to maintenance to working capital optimization. And even we talked a bit about how do we maximize our talents, our superheroes that exist within our organization. As we go into today's discussion, I think the real challenge that we all face is that S/4HANA is on the verge of this journey that we're all on, right? And we all know that the goalposts has moved from 2025 to 2027, but there's still a lot of question around it. If you speak to most technical people, everybody will tell you it's the right thing to do, it's the future, this is where SAP is going, etc. If you ask the business, most people just don't know why they need to change. Or on the flip side, they hope that life will be better on the other side of S/4HANA. So what I wanted to do specifically is, as we go through this particular deck, I want to call out two things. I want to talk a bit about the agenda that we have on right now on the screen, which is about the obstacles and the approaches and the readiness for S/4HANA as an organization. But there's a second component that I want to call out as we go through this, is say, how do we utilize this SAP asset that I keep referring to? How do we turn that into something that actually helps self-fund our journey to S/4HANA? Now, I know that sounds a little utopian, but in reality, it's very doable. And even if it's not 100% self-funding, is a significant chunk of which will help with the migration to S/4HANA. So I want to debate that with you guys a little bit today and work through those particular alternatives. But let's just start off with the obvious thing, right? And that has got to do with the obstacles that typically companies face with S/4HANA. We supported a research that was independently done by SAP Insider regarding transformation of intelligent supply chains, and they specifically referenced the S/4HANA journey for most organizations. And here are some of the claims or obstacles companies suggested they were dealing with. I'm going to just pause for a second so you can read the statistics. And you can see most of them are actually got to do very much about, again, the mindset of what's going to cost me X, am I going to get a Y return for it? Not whether this is a strategic imperative, not whether this is going to transform my organization from A to B, not whether this is going to help me change my business model. It really comes down to, hey, somebody told me I need to upgrade by 2027. And okay, what's it going to cost to get there? How much is it? What's the disruption like, etc. And so in reality, these things are, I think, in many ways, somewhat excuses to really dealing with the actual elephant in the room. And I'm going to try to address that a little bit with us today, because I believe most people, when they look at the S/4HANA journey, somewhat find themselves casting their minds back to the day that they went live the first time. And the cost, the disruption, the impact it had on the business, the pain that followed. In some cases, customers didn't get their product. In some cases, we were working, 70, 80 hours a week. And there's almost this fear of going there again. And so I want to submit to you that I almost think that possibly one of the biggest obstacles that companies are facing trying to get to S/4HANA is remembering what it was like, right? And if you kind of think back of how SAP came about the first time, we were so focused on getting the system in because we were coming from some kind of legacy system. Maybe if you were back in the late 90s, you were trying to just get into the Y2K scenario. If anything between the 1990s to 2000 to now, it's been mostly to try and modernize your technology. And so we put the transactions, but however, what happens is that there's just a tremendous amount of frustration that follows. And so there's all these common problems that start arising, right? We have limited functionality that we were taught to use, or we just didn't really understand the need to maintain and manage our housekeeping and our data specifically. So we started creating a large amount of manual work. It felt like it was harder work to do when we went live than when we were before that. I don't know how many times I heard somebody saying, oh, I wish we just kept the system we had, right? And I believe a lot of that frustration and concern is kind of existing in companies right now as they're thinking about S/4HANA. The result, of course, with that scenario is that you've got frustrated users, you don't trust the data, so you bolt on a whole bunch of extra technology to try and make it work. We create BW reports upon BW reports, filtering out all the what we call bad data, and then we still dump it into a spreadsheet to manipulate it in a way that is user-friendly or leadership-friendly, if you want. And our IT costs never really reduced. Frankly, if anything, it probably increased. Operational costs got worse. We had to hire so many more people to deal with all these transactions. And so I get the sense that there's just this hesitancy to move because of this fear of the implementation trap. Now, I want to talk you through that in a little more specific detail, because I think what's important is if you think about what we went through in the past, we also want to think about what that's going to look like for us in the future. And if you think of a typical implementation, right? We plan it, we blueprint it, we configure, we customize, we do some kind of data load, we test, and we train. And like I mentioned, often the predominant focus is really to get the system up and running. And our measure of success is usually the system's live, it's working, right? The data migrated error-free, the user security is in place, the design matches the business need, we hope, right? The solution is documented, users were trained, and the support's available. So if we have that list, check, the project was a success. Of course, what follows is some version of a hypercare, whether it was 2 weeks or 2 months. Then there's a typical support phase, and then of course we go into continuous improvement projects. The challenge, however, is that most companies, when they go past that go live state, truly never really see the benefit they were hoping for from a business perspective, right? So where we were measuring our success from a go live perspective based on systematic checkboxes, from a business point of view, the business never really owned SAP, never really took it on and said it's ours to run with. It was almost like it was given to them by IT and say, here you go, here's your new tool. They never really were educated on how it actually works end to end. What typically is found is that they get taught how to do a handful of transactions that's in their role, but beyond that, they're not taught how it fits within the bigger picture and how their whole business is supposed to act. Change management wasn't necessarily done to its most effective way. More likely, it was just a bunch of posters and newsletters, but not really hearts and minds with change as we brought people along for the journey. We also find that typically what happens is we still never really broke our silos. So we still live within our customer service silo and our procurement silo and our manufacturing silo and our warehousing silo and then finance silo, and everybody just kind of tosses the information or the data over the wall to each other. And that integrated value that SAP brings to the table, it wasn't mimicked in the organization, having cross-functional organizational alignment. And so, of course, spreadsheets become the order of the day, or we look for a series of third-party tools to kind of make up for that. And ultimately, what we strategically expected to get out of this, tactically, we're just not getting. And so if you had to ask IT, did we get a return on investment? More likely we'll say yes, because we achieved all those technical things, and now we're on a single source of truth, and we have a single platform, etc. If you ask the business, did anything get much better? More likely than not, you're going to hear no. And so I think that's part of what's weighing everybody down in terms of not being able to achieve this. And so these elusive benefits, if you want, that was expected to have been achieved, which is how we sold it, which is, by the way, no different to how we're selling S4HANA now. If you read the business cases of a lot of these S4HANA projects, if you put aside the technological advancements around cloud and single platforms and standardization, yeah, those are all very, very valuable. But it's still marred by all of these business benefits that we're going to get. Our service levels are definitely this time going to improve. Our inventory is going to be optimized, and we're going to definitely have a lower cost. We're going to be able to utilize people better. We're going to help make them planners rather than doers. We're going to have better decision making because we're going to trust the data. We're going to have minimal flexibility, so maximum flexibility. But these elusive benefits tends to not necessarily be seen in what we would expect. And I think that once again, because we're marred by this idea that we never saw that the first time, and now it's 20 years later and we still don't see it, what's going to be different? And if you continue this discussion, you think of the IT effort. The IT effort, started with the design, but then it never really tapered down much. It went kind of into the support. It kept going. It may have turned down towards the end, hopefully, if you got a lot of continuous improvement projects in place. But for the most part, the IT cost and effort just maintained a very high level. The business effort had some involvement up front in the blueprint, less so during configuration, but then towards the end, the testing and training. But thereafter, it just became a real hard work. The effort for the business was, I've got all these transactions I have to keep track of, but I don't know how to plan in SAP, so I'm planning in the spreadsheet. So it feels like I'm doing all this extra work all the time, right? And because of that, the business user adoption goes from that excitement stage of a new project, a new system, and just over time, slowly but surely just wanes to the point where there's limited buy-in, limited adoption. And for the most part, people are using it just to keep track of the transactions. It's a record-keeping tool more than anything else. So I submit to you then the question, why do we think it's going to be different? I think that's part of the fear of what organizations are struggling with right now, right? Is that there's this notion that maybe the Greenfield is going to be better for us, because what we did wrong the first time in 1999 or in 2013 is going to be different, because this time we're going to stick to the master data settings and put the right business rules in place. This time we're going to spend a lot more time with change management and educating our team as opposed to just training the people. This time we're going to leverage all the best practices and really focus on standard SAP and not customize anything. I believe that there's a skepticism that this is not going to work, and frankly, a Greenfield, implementation is an incredibly disruptive and costly experience. So with that being said, this is what I was mentioning earlier. How do we think and how do we believe that this elephant in the room around taking an environment where we have spreadsheets galore, we don't trust the data, everybody's got their own source of truth, there's unpredictability throughout, and we're still living in a side. How do we believe that when we take that and put that into S/4HANA, that we're not just going to find ourselves on the other side with exactly the same outcome? And so in our experiences is after we've done some research with organizations that have gone to S/4HANA, is that as much as it transactionally was successful, we have yet to see an organization truly be able to say that they've made major shifts in the way they run their business in terms of the improvement. And so really what we've done is we've just kind of put lipstick on the pig. We've really just got a better front end. We've got some better GUI around Fiori. The technology, by the way, is fabulous and is incredibly powerful. But because we didn't address some of the basics up front, we're just kind of finding ourselves caught up with the same constraints on the back end, and now kind of moving slowly but surely back into the old ways of doing things. Because guess what? My customers still want their product, and we still got to get it shipped. So I got to plan it, and that old spreadsheet of mine just looks really awesome right now. So I think that's been one of the biggest challenges of companies moving forward. So let's talk a bit about what are the approaches that exist, right? So if those are our challenges that we need to do, what do we really have as an option to move forward? And I think, like I mentioned earlier, it is apparent, and actually, if you look at the research out there between Gartner and any other group, they continue to reference the fact that it's just impossible to address your current challenges and still expect to gain maximum benefits from a new, from scratch implementation, whether this is S/4HANA or whether it's even an alternative software, right? So before you hit the reset button, we really have to think about what good looks like, because one thing S/4HANA is going to bring to us is a live environment. So MRP is going to run live, information is going to be running live with the column databases. The system data is so much faster, and so there's an expectation that as an organization we're actually mature enough to deal with the speed of the data. But if we're not, guess what? All we're going to do is we're going to just accelerate the chaos. We're just taking the chaos that we have right now and we're just making it faster. So the two paths that we technically have to get to S/4HANA is the Greenfield option and the migration option. The Greenfield option suggests that we start from scratch, we blueprint, we look at best practices, we dump all the master data, we clean it up, we refine it. We basically start over, right? It's kind of the notion I was referencing earlier. The thing that most people fear is this idea that we're now going to go through all of this again for the next 2 or 3 years. And there's some research out there that shows that that can cost up to 5% of an organization's revenue stream. And so it's a very costly, very disruptive environment. The alternative is a migration. Now, migration is often considered nowadays as I just moved the technology from ECC to S4, right? I'm not really improving the business. I'm not really improving the processes. I'm really doing a technical upgrade, if you want. But I think there's more to that migration discussion that I want to bring to your attention. So let's break these two things into these different worlds. And you'll notice the bubbles on the left. These are the 3 things that SAP suggests, or PaaS suggests you have. You have the new implementation, you have the system conversion and landscape transformation. And the system conversion is kind of moving from ECC to S/4HANA. The landscape transformation meaning going from on-prem to cloud. But those 2 in the bottom technically are a migration of sorts. But let's take the new implementation. So like I mentioned, we kind of go through our motions of blueprinting, we're realizing, we're testing, we're training, we go live. And the outcomes, like I said, if we're lucky, we get all the transactionals to do what it needs to do. But the biggest challenge is that the outcomes are typically very costly, incredibly risky, because we're taking people out of the business again. We're getting them to sit through the blueprinting phases and all that. So it's a big lift. It's a very disruptive lift to the business because we're taking some of those key folks out again. It's a radical change to the organization once again, and we have to relearn and adopt all these S/4HANA capabilities, right? Because what we may have done in the past in ECC, it doesn't necessarily look the same in S/4HANA. The alternative is that we migrate, right? Now, Migrate assumes that we have a heavily customized environment. We don't trust the data. We have a whole bunch of mass data inconsistencies. We have uneducated or lack of knowledge within the organization. All the symptoms I mentioned earlier, which of course, through the Greenfield option, the top line, we hope to redo that, right, and not go through it again. But with migration, if you take that and you move it over to S/4HANA, you've really technically just taken all the bad behaviors with you. So you're basically taking the dirty oil and put it into the new engine. And so what we've done is our outcomes there are kind of what I mentioned earlier, right? Accelerating some of the chaos. We have limited change, so that's a benefit, but there's also limited benefit, which is a detractor from this. We can't maximize the use of the new technology as much because we're still dealing with all these basic foundational challenges. And of course, it is risky, right? Because we're taking this bad oil again and putting it into this new engine. And we know that at some point it'll have an impact. So let's talk through options. So this illustration kind of mimics what I showed you earlier. Option one, if you go down the path of implementing Greenfield, there's a good likelihood that you're going to end up with a lot of that manual intervention and mistrust and unpredictability on the back end. It may take time to get there because we're going to come in with the right intentions, but over 2 or 3 years from not controlling those governance aspects, we'll kind of slip back to where we were. You can then decide to optimize your end-to-end business processes to give you some of that automation and create more predictability in the business, kind of get that heavy cyclical chaos to kind of tighten that down and then get some benefit at the back end of that. So it's the go to S/4HANA now the way you are in the state that you're in, and then try and fix it later, right? So the challenge with that is that if you look at that, the outcomes of that is that you have this optimized process later, but it costs you now twice, right? So what you have to now do your blueprint and your realization, your whole basically Greenfield implementation is going to be up to 5% of your revenue, heavy cost, heavy disruption, and I'm going to have to go and optimize my processes later, because there's very little research that's going to show that we're going to come out the other side much better than what was originally intended 10 years ago when you went live. So double the cost, double the change management effort, because you have to now change twice. The behaviors don't change until later, and there's limited benefits in some of the new functionality because we're still struggling with the basic stuff, right? So it's a real challenge, but there are organizations that choose to go this path for whatever reason that they believe works for their organization's maturity. Option two suggests that you take all that manual intervention, all the spreadsheets and mistrust, all that unpredictability, and you take that and you optimize it in its current state in ECC, right? So you put yourself in a place where you come out the other side with a lot more automation, a lot more best practices, a lot better educated users. The organization works in an integrated fashion. I can actually make a promise and keep a promise. My schedule attainment within my manufacturing is increasing. My inventory optimization is happening. And so the outcome of an optimization effort typically is exactly that. I have working capital reductions, I have customer service improvements, operational efficiencies, purchasing spend reductions, and ultimately an EBITDA improvement, right? But I think more importantly, what this does is not only do you get a benefit out of this program, right? As you can see there from a working capital perspective, as well as all the other cost components, but you're actually taking and migrating now a best practice, new behaviors, limited to no customizations, because we've eliminated that originally in the optimization. We take users that are now really understand how SAP works, and we put them into the new system, and they're actually able to maximize and capitalize off of S4HANA. And you can really start automating your transactions, starting using some machine learning and AI technology to really take you to the next level. So from a maturity perspective, it helps transition you and transform the organization through a process of uplifting your current state to prepare yourself for the future state. But not only does it give you that, this is where it also then helps start funding that migration, which I mentioned, because those benefits that come out the other side are significant. And some of that's significant, and some of those numbers are millions and millions of dollars. And if that's not sufficient to help with the migration, it definitely covers a significant portion of that cost. And of course, the cost to migrate is far lower than the cost to actually do a Greenfield implementation. Because a Greenfield is up to 5%, and a migration is less than 2% of revenue typically for organizations. So another way to look at it, right, is that we take the migration path, we optimize our processes and system and align our people. There's a cost component to that for sure, but then there's a benefit that comes from that, and that benefit then helps us free up some cash to be able to pay for the migration. But you'll notice the price tag on that's also lower, and therefore gives us the opportunity to now come out the other side with not only a shorter time frame, but also we have an optimal state. It's significantly dollars saved. We actually set ourselves up for a blueprint for the future, because now we get to know what good looks like. It helps us obviously self-funded, as we mentioned. It's less risky, it's less disruptive, because we're doing it while the people are doing their current job. It's not a take people out of their job and go and implement. You're actually doing the optimization and the migration while they're doing their current job. So the disruption to the business is significantly lower. And the change management effort is much less, because you go through that once through the optimization and sets you up from a migration perspective going forward. And it really sets you up to maximize the functionality of S4HANA's capabilities. You don't come out the other side just with better looking transactions. You actually come out the other side with better functionality for the organization. There's a third option though. Some companies have considered doing this, where they believe in the Greenfield idea, that they want to do it quickly and they want to do it big bang and they want to try and get everybody on the same page. But yet also understand that you can't take the old and hope that you're going to get a new state, right? So somewhere, is there a way to combine the notion of optimizing and maximizing? And we call this the optimization Brownfield path, right? Because what we're saying is as you're working through an optimization effort, in parallel, you're starting to work on your migration to S4HANA, which starts setting you up for a parallel path. And so you're able to get to the outcome of both the value from the optimization and the blueprinting that it provides you, as well as the conversion of the SAP system at the same time to migration. Clearly, that will take a little longer to do since you're running them in parallel, because there's more effort involved. But you'll get both done at the same time, and at the end of the day, the business will benefit as well. There are a lot to be discussed through this option, and happy to further any questions if you have any more on those as well. So what that really means is you actually go about implementing, you almost go through the Greenfield mindset, but you do it with what we call optimization principles. An optimization principle says you don't just train the users, you really educate them on how the system works. And you use your current system and your current behaviors and your current challenges as the schoolyard, right? That's the opportunity for us to then utilize and get folks to understand how to use the technologies to the point where it's mostly automated and we're really managing by exception. And as you're going through that, you're actually defining the blueprint for the S4HANA state. And the outcome of that is that you end up with an education throughout the organization, throughout the program. It's not just a one-time educational or training session. They've been educated for a long period of time. The master data that moves over is not only cleaned during the optimization, but also maintained and owned and sustained through the implementation. So we won't have those issues later again. There's better understanding of the functionality, a lot more automation put in place that can be then capitalized on the S/4HANA side. And once again, a single kind of change management effort, right? We're not doing this twice to get people to the other side. So kind of bring it back to the earlier conversation I showed of how typically bad implementations happen. Here's the implementation or a greenfield option with the optimization principles. We have our planning, our blueprinting, and customization and configuration phases of the project. But this is really focused. If you look at the primary focus is preparing the business to run optimally using SAP. Where the primary focus the first time was getting the transactions to work. Now we're preparing the business for an optimal use of SAP. And the first measure of success is not whether the system is working, whether the data is being migrated error-free. The first measure of success is making sure that technically it's in place, but almost instantaneously we're also getting the benefits and overcoming the challenges that I mentioned earlier. So the goal is to get better business outcomes. And so if you overlay that with an optimization mindset of saying, how do I educate, optimize, and sustain my business throughout the process of doing a blueprint and customizing the program, you end up with a scenario where you are able to overcome a lot of those challenges that we raised as original challenges in our first go live, based on the notion that you're actually addressing those through the optimization effort itself. And so the second measure of success then is truly having service levels in place that are improving. Our inventory has improved and is continuing to improve. The throughput from our manufacturing processes around setup time and queuing time and scheduling capacity leveling is now far better managed and brought over to the new system. And we're able to increase flexibility and become much more exception-minded. The interesting thing, though, is through this model, you find that the IT effort is still pretty high in the beginning as we implement, but it very quickly tapers down. And instead of being a firefighter model, it becomes more of a strategic input on where can we do things better going forward. IT plays a much more strategic role in guiding the organization around new functionality that could be improving the business. The business effort is somewhat similar. It kind of has a high end in the front, but then there's also another high spike through the optimization efforts, because they're the ones actually doing the work of optimizing the business. But then over time, you'll notice that as the system does more of the work for them, more of the automation's in place, less manual efforts, less spreadsheets, less customization, less touching the system every time a PO is created or production order is created, you'll notice that the effort reduces and they can really start utilizing their time to plan and analyze more effectively. And ultimately, what it really does is it shows how the user adoption of that particular model starts increasing, because now that you have an optimal business process, a technology that actually is working as designed, we're managing the data on a daily or weekly basis to make sure that it's accurate, and we're using the data that we're putting in place to help analyze and project the future so we can adjust the rules. You basically are really just turning the dials to run the business as opposed to transacting to run the business. And that user adoption just takes off because you're freeing people up from being caught up in the minutiae of day-to-day transactional work. Okay, let me wrap up a little bit with the readiness. And the question at hand is, are we ready, and for which model are we ready, right? So a couple questions I'd suggest you ask yourself as an organization, right? Especially if you start thinking about the wheel on the right-hand side regarding, the user competence and capability, the master data, how many exceptions and customizations exist, what's our measures, how do we work cross-function as a team, do we trust the data? So the questions on the left-hand side are great, right? So do we believe that we have highly educated users in the business using SAP? Do we believe the users are managing only the rules to manage the business, or they're managing the business and then telling SAP what they did? Do we believe that they have a high business maturity and acceptance mindset? And I'm going to speak to business maturity in the next slide. Do we believe that we have the right operational measures in place that maintain a constant sustainability and a governance structure around the organization meeting its goals? Do we work together as a cross-functional team, or do we still live in our silos? And do we trust the data throughout the organization? Not my spreadsheet and not some custom report or some BI report. Do I trust the information at the core, at either the ECC or the S/4HANA core, right? If you answer yes to the majority of these, then you're most likely not ready for the new wave of S/4HANA without considering one of the two alternative options I suggested about optimizing first and then migrating, or optimizing while implementing. So the business maturity continuum, and if you've been following Reveal, you've seen this multiple times, is at the heart of our philosophy and mindset. But again, it kind of asks you the same question. You know, if you believe you're kind of in that 4 to 5 state where you're in a agile organization, you're in an agile supply chain, you're in an agile manufacturing environment, where you're constantly optimizing the lead times and the cycle times and my queuing times and setup times and all of my quantities and my inventory and service levels, I'm in an optimal state and constantly driving business value, then you're probably in the state and ready for S/4HANA. If you kind of find yourself in 1, 2, or 3, which is, you know, the system's not a single source of truth, I don't trust the transactional information, and the mass of that for sure is not representative of the business reality, you're really probably underutilizing SAP as it's designed. And you'll notice that if you're in 1 to 3, you're less than 45% utilizing SAP's capability to truly get you to the next level. And that's where I submit back to kind of my original hypothesis, which was around, if you're kind of in that state of chaos and you take yourself from there to S/4HANA, you're just going to accelerate it. And if you're in that state of chaos and you think through a greenfield opportunity, you're going to eliminate that and do it right the first time. Unfortunately, human behavior doesn't change overnight, and there's a true potential risk that won't change with your greenfield opportunity. So you would ask yourself for sure where you are in this whole continuum, and if you're kind of in the 3 to 4, 4 to 5 range, then you're probably ready for S/4HANA the way you are as an organization. If not, I again submit that you probably need to rethink about where you're at with regard to the organizational changes that you need to think about before going there. And again, I'm talking specifically about organizational business maturity. I'm not talking about technological maturity. The SAP system is mature to handle your business. It's really a question about, am I ready for the technology, and do I have all the pieces in place? Okay, let's wrap up a little bit. Just briefly, you know, thinking about this SAP as an asset was the whole theme of this webinar series. And the more we think about SAP as an asset to our organization, if you think of it as your single and nervous system of your body and of your organization, then you do see it more than a tool. And then that asset is something that you can maximize through the use of S/4HANA as you put the right processes in place. We do have to understand that hoping it will be better this time is not a strategy. You know, hope is never a strategy, but hoping that we think we're going to do it better this time because we've seen it before. We have yet to see true case studies that is actually the case. Greenfield is very expensive, disruptive, and potentially unnecessary if you consider the alternatives to that, which is to either consider optimizing your processes now and then moving to S/4HANA, which will be a much less costly and potentially even self-funded option for the organization. If you have time, then of course you could optimize your processes now and ultimately migrate to S/4HANA. And reverting back to number one, the point there is if you're already on S/4HANA, you can still consider the optimization process, right? But if you really do not have time and you have some kind of deadline that you have to meet, consider an optimization principled or an optimized brownfield where we take the optimization mindset and all the principles around data disciplines, data governance, best practices, educated users, optimal supply chains, optimal manufacturing capabilities, and do that in conjunction with an implementation down the road so that you're able to get the most out of your implementation. Or the alternative is optimize and then migrate later at the same time. So a couple options for you to consider. And like I said, would love to explore that with you if there are any further questions around that. So in summary, this was our series for the year. And we just finished off with a self-funding discussion around moving to S/4HANA. So yes, Kelly, if there are any other questions, I'd love to see if I can help catch up on some of those.
Yeah, I am going to answer one question that came through, and this recording will be available on the website, so you can review it there as well. We had a short question about that. The next question we have for you, Martin, is do you think the migration to S4 has slowed down due to COVID?
I actually do. I think that the S/4HANA has always remained on the roadmap, but I do believe it has been pushed out. COVID was so disruptive to organizations. I actually spoke yesterday at the SAP Insider conference on this, where the discussion was, what did we learn from COVID and how did it disrupt our supply chains and what do our supply chains do now going forward? And interestingly, though, is that one thing that became very apparent through COVID is that we realized how vulnerable our supply chains really are. And so the notion is that there's a lot more people thinking about optimizing and sorting out their current supply chain challenges before moving to S/4HANA. But the S/4HANA is still on the roadmap, but for sure, we've seen quite a few of those delaying the implementation.
Okay, the next question we have is how many companies do you believe are actually ready to utilize S4 to its fullest extent?
No, prior to S4 even, when we did our research, we estimated that about 80% of the organizations are not utilizing SAP as designed or as intended, and really are underutilizing it. And with the notion and advent of S/4HANA on the horizon, and with a lot more people thinking about using Greenfield option to move forward, we've done some additional research and spoke to many companies regarding their plans and how they're considering doing that. And I would suggest that the number hasn't changed much. You know, there's other researchers out there that have said, you know, as high as 90%, but I would still submit between 80 and 90% of companies are just not necessarily ready for it. And we'll still think about and still consider, you know, going to S/4HANA with a Greenfield option, but obviously with the risks that I've stated earlier. So it's still a significantly high number of companies that are just not mature enough for what S/4HANA can bring for them.
So this is a two-part question they have. The first part is, if some of their plants are not on SAP, do you recommend Greenfield for them or migration for the ones that are on ECC? And then the second part of their question was if you would recommend going to IBP for S&OP, demand planning, and inventory.
Can you repeat the first one? It broke up there for a second, Kelly.
Sure. It says, yeah, if some of their plants are not on SAP, Do you recommend Greenfield for those plants and migration for the ones that are on ECC?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So there's never a complete migration option, because if you're thinking about just finance, S/4HANA Central Finance, in many ways that has to be somewhat of a greenfield because of the different rules and things that they bring into it. And so there is always some form of a hybrid, and that would be a good example of if we have plans that haven't been on SAP, you could go for sure greenfield for those. Just understand that all of the issues related to master data management, education of users, making sure they really understand how to use the system afterwards, is still going to be challenges. So if you do that right, you're able to use that definitely for sure as an option, as kind of like a perfect plant if you want model. And then for those that are on SAP already, the migration path would be a more effective one if you do the optimization effort ahead of time, right? So the more you do that to be able to address the processes and the user component, because think about this for a second. If you think of the three-legged stool, people, process, technology, the technology is really only a small component of the whole problem. And the whole is the 2/3 the people and process side of things. And so it is really needed to be addressed ahead of time.
All right, it looks like that's all of the questions. Oh, I'm sorry, Martin.
The second part of the question was around IBP.
Yeah, the IBP, they said, do you recommend going from IBP to S&OP demand planning and inventory?
Yeah, so again, I believe this is a maturity question and discussion. When many companies and are on APO, some version of APO, and some have just remained on ECC. And so SAP's roadmap is very clear that IBP is the future state of both versions from a long-term S&OP planning perspective for both ECC and APO. However, I would suggest once again that from a maturation perspective and maturing the organization, that if you have not been doing S&OP at all, there are options to do that in ECC, very basic ones, but something that will help get your monthly cadence in place and get your consensus plans working. If you're on APO, you could do the same in APO, but ultimately over time, you would want to move towards an integrated tool like IBP to get the integration with finance, the business plans, and any other related external data to come into it. So yeah, that would be the recommendation.
All right, thank you, Martin. It looks like that's all the time that we have for today. But I did want to let everybody know, we want to invite you to join our 3-day morning boot camp that is coming up. We'll be hosting that live from January 27th to the 29th in 2021. This is going to be 12 hours of educating individuals to use the capabilities already built in SAP. We will get into SAP and you will have the opportunity to discover and apply what you have learned right then and there. You can visit this web address that we have here on the screen, revealvalue.com/events/bootcamp, and that'll have some more information for you, and you can register there as well. So we hope you can attend this. And then again, our next webinar series is coming up at the beginning of next year, February 17th, 2021. This series is going to start out with our supply chain and operational excellence in the new normal. So that will be coming, we will send out more information and the topics regarding this as well soon. And then again, thank you everybody again for joining us today. This webinar will be available on our website at revealvalue.com under the resources tab. If you missed one of our previous webinars, you can also find all of our pre-recorded webinars here as well, along with other information and content areas like our white papers, success stories, and other helpful tips and tools that we offer. So this concludes our presentation for today. Everyone have a safe and healthy holiday and a happy new year.